The Gun Fanatic's Guide to the Galaxy.
The following is a conversation with Todd Howard, one of the greatest video game designers of all time. He has led the development of the Fallout series and the Elder Scrolls series, including Arena, Daggerfall, Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, and the future Elder Scrolls 6, and a totally new world in an upcoming game called Starfield. And now, dear friends, here's Todd Howard. What does a perfectly productive day in the life of Todd Howard look like?
I enjoy strolling and watching the sunset.
That must be, a deep embodiment of what loneliness is like.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's okay to let just like the time settle. Meaning you step out, just how does the wind sound? How are the trees moving? How are the clouds moving? Mushroom trees and giant insects and things like that.
So you've created some of the greatest games ever. I think there's the question would be, what's the best game of all time? All right. Just give me a second. Tetris?
Wayne Gretzky Hockey 3.
What are your thoughts about dragons?
You can make the argument that dragons existed.
Do you ever think about making people feel like human feelings, like fear, anger, longing, loneliness with Starfield?
All the above. Yeah, of course.
What do you think is the meaning of life, Todd Howard?
It's really all of us together.
Okay. You mentioned Starfield. What is Starfield?
It's okay.
Okay. Guys and gals, I can't wait to see what you create next. It really, really does have an impact on silly kids like me and millions of silly kids like me. So I really appreciate everything.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.
Welcome back to NASA Punk for more Starfield news and updates. I'm a little late to the party on this one, as much of you already know. We've got some great new updates about Starfield coming straight from the mouth of the wizard himself, the great Zordon, our Lord and Savior, Todd Howard. Not only that, but I've got an update about the upcoming Game Awards on December 8th and the possible reveal of Starfield's release date. You're going to want to stick around for that, so make sure you watch the whole video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so I can keep creating original content for you guys with that NASA Punk spin. You know I always try to keep things interesting on this channel. So anyway, Todd Howard recently did an interview with a very well-known podcaster and YouTube personality known as Lex Fridman. Lex interviews many big-time personalities in media and gaming and just had Todd Howard on the show recently. It was a tremendously long conversation, as they usually go with Lex, but much of it was very relevant to the development of Starfield, with a large portion in the middle being strictly about Starfield. Because the interview was so lengthy, I'm going to be talking about just the Starfield portion of it, with plans to go more in-depth in a different video about what else we can draw from it in regards to Starfield. But for now, let's dive into that Starfield part of the conversation.
Okay. You mentioned Starfield. What is Starfield? And what's the origin story of this game?
So Todd goes on to talk about always wanting to do the explore space role-playing game. He goes on to compare Starfield to an old-school pen and paper RPG called Traveler, as well as a few other games such as Starflight, Star Control 2, and Sundog. He talks about how in between Fallout 4 and Elder Scrolls 6 was the perfect time to create this explore the galaxy sci-fi game. Lex goes on to mention the 1,000 planets in Starfield and asks Todd, what is the world of stars and planets like? Todd replies expressing that there was some question about whether or not they could pull off rendering planets for players to explore in their entirety, or if they would have to create a smaller, more contrived world space within those planets, having a much more limited set of them. He described this option for Starfield as being the wrong tone. Like he said before, Todd reminds us that Bethesda likes to say yes as often as possible, but there was some concern.
How are we going to render a planet, like pull it off for the player? Like, can we? Or do we have to sort of do it where you can't land on all of them? where you're landing in a very controlled, small world space that we, kind of craft, and you would have a very limited set of those.
Mhm.
If you go back to tone, like, well, that's probably the wrong tone. And how can we say yes? Like, I want to land on that ice ball.
He also talks about how they started working on Starfield right after Fallout 4, so it was sometime in 2016, which matches the estimation in one of my previous videos that Starfield will have undergone close to a full 7-year development cycle by the time it releases in 2023. So those of you that are worried about this game releasing in a state similar to Cyberpunk 2077, just know that Starfield will have had up to 3 years longer than Cyberpunk's apparent 4-year development cycle, as the early build of Cyberpunk was allegedly scrapped a third of the way through its development. But anyway, back to the planets. Todd talks about how they needed to come up with a reasonable system for creating believable planets in order to address the concern of having multiple planets and star systems that aren't just, quote, fractally goop.
Well, what's the technical definition of goop? Fractally goop.
Fractally goop. You've probably seen a lot of like simulations, whether they're space things or landscape things, where they're using fractals and just the landscape does not look real. It just is like highs and lows and it's muddy.
He talks about a system they developed where they had tiles of landscape they created that they could combine, blend together, and then wrap around a planet to create a very believable terrain. They were then faced with the inevitable issue of players landing on planets that contained essentially nothing but resources to mine, and implied that they had to figure out what planets would essentially represent this lonely experience. But he seems to equate these empty planets with Starfield's level of realism.
I think it gives them the ability to say, I want to go do that and see that on that place, as long as we tell them, hey, the quest leads over here. Here's where the handcrafted content is that you would expect. And then here's more of the open procedural planet experience.
He also talks about how the lonely moments in Starfield can be quite beautiful, because the star systems, planets, and moons are all modeled after a real simulated orbit, so you can actually watch moons, sunrises, and sunsets all moving in their distinct patterns on these certain planets. He then goes on to give us some great insight into how accessing the star systems works in Starfield. Todd says that each system is based on a level that is likely scaled to the player's own level and experience, much like other games where areas of the world map are either restricted or recommended against for lower level players. So if you're able to access higher level systems, you may want to avoid them until you level up or have the right gear. Todd goes on to talk about how their decision to remove the ability to run out of fuel was driven by the mechanic feeling like a fun killer in hindsight, though it seemed fun at the moment. He also mentioned that it's possible there will be a future update to Starfield including a hardcore survival mode in which the fuel mechanic would make its return. When speaking to the more survival sim elements of the game, Todd brings up the various traits and buffs of armor types in the game.
But it's more of like a tone, how they build their ships. Do they have all the right things for safety? We do get into environmental things on the planets, in your spacesuit. Obviously, there are a lot of different spacesuits and buffs for the gases or the toxicity or the temperature on various planets.
When asked about robots such as Vasco, Todd says that in reality, robots are charted to play a much greater role in our own future than they do for the people in Starfield, but that was meant intentionally to match the tone of the game, where robots would be more generic and used mostly for utility and combat in Starfield.
So it's a deeply human world.
Very much, yes.
In terms of
Yes.
tone.
After a lengthy description of Todd's time spent at SpaceX, marveling at the technology and ingenuity, Lex proceeded to ask if Todd was able to capture any of that majesty in the game, to which he replied,
I think some of it we're doing when you're standing on a planet and you see the other moons go by,
Yeah.
and then you realize I could get in my ship, blast off, and land there and build myself a home. I think that's pretty cool. There's a minor thing we do, which is we have other ships come and go from the starports when you're there. So you'll be in a city and then you hear this, and you hear the engine, you look up and a ship is taking off or coming out. Like,
That's great.
there's nothing for you to do, but I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
Todd then went on to describe how sometimes you jump into a system and there are freighters, and sometimes they even contact you. So it's not all just jump in and combat. Towards the end of the Starfield interview section, there was less discussion about the game directly, and more about the philosophy of space exploration and essentially the Fermi Paradox. If you're not familiar with the Fermi Paradox or why we're seemingly alone in the universe, I made the most entertaining video you'll ever watch on the topic, and you can click it in the top right of the screen now. Todd Howard goes on to talk about how finding life on other planets is actually a big dream of his.
It's almost a dream of mine, like in our lifetimes, that we discover life on another planet.
Yeah, especially if it's intelligent life. I've been talking to a lot of biologists and a lot of folks. I imagine there's life everywhere out there.
The numbers would say so, yes.
And that's the gist of the directly Starfield related parts of the interview with Todd Howard on the Lex Fridman podcast. Thanks to Lex for hosting this intriguing interview. He's got a great channel, go check him out and be sure to subscribe as well. Okay, before I end the video, I wanted to talk to you guys about the possibility of seeing some new Starfield gameplay premiered at the Game Awards on December 8th. Could some new information or footage from Starfield be coming that soon? Here's why I think so. In one of my previous videos, I talked about how we were starved for new Starfield content sometime in late August. Though we did get the new Constellation Questions video series from Bethesda recently, which showed us some of how the dialogue system works, I figured that the next time we'd see a more in-depth look at Starfield gameplay would likely be the Game Awards. Now we have some information or rumors that this could be the case. According to one insider known as Snowin, not only will we get new Starfield gameplay at the Game Awards, but finally, actually, a release date. I know, right? That would be insane. I mean, if they were going to premiere anything during the holiday season involving Starfield, this would be the way to do it. Honestly, take this with a grain of salt, as it hasn't been confirmed by any means, but just know that it's certainly a possibility, and I for one am excited to tune in to the Game Awards and find out. Well, that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for tuning in, you guys. I appreciate every one of you, and I've got some great content waiting in the wings, so be sure to stay tuned as we look forward to the future.